Hi there, and welcome to Oaklandside 510. I'm Darwin BondGraham, news editor at the Oaklandside. I'm filling in this week for our editor-in-chief, Tasneem Raja, who's on a vacation. Before we get into today's episode, I have some great news. We hit our $15,000 fundraising goal. That means we can keep producing the 510 podcast for another 6 months. Thank you to everyone who chipped in. Your support means we can keep bringing you Oakland news in this format. We're very grateful. In today's episode, after Police Chief Floyd Mitchell's surprise resignation last week, some Oakland residents are pointing fingers at the Civilian Oversight Commission that's watched over OPD since 2017. But is the blame misplaced? Plus, Oakland's airport is refusing to screen a partisan video from Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. And we remember Reverend J. Alfred Smith Sr., the legendary Allen Temple pastor who spent decades building housing and community power in East Oakland. Also, a new tax for Oakland residents could be headed to the ballot, and why Oakland isn't sending more players to the WNBA. Then for today's deep dive, I talked with our school's reporter Ashley McBride about violence interrupters in Oakland high schools. These are the people who work every day to prevent fights and keep students safe. And we'll talk about why their funding might be running out. All right, let's get into this week's news. There's more in the full stories, which we'll link to in the show notes, and you can always find more at oaklandside.org. By the way, if you want to get our reporting in your inbox, sign up for our daily newsletter through our homepage. First up, in last week's episode, we told you about how Police Chief Floyd Mitchell announced his resignation. He hasn't shared why he's leaving after just 18 months on the job, so there's a lot of speculation. Some Oakland residents are blaming the police commission for pushing him out, though. The police commission had a meeting soon after Chief Mitchell made his surprise announcement. At that meeting, several residents speculated that Mitchell left because he was frustrated with the civilian oversight body. Rajni Mandal, a District 4 resident and activist, blamed the commission and police reform advocates for, quote, plunging the city into chaos. Another resident said obstacles driven by the commission made it impossible for Mitchell to lead the force. In meetings, there's definitely been tension between Mitchell and the commission over things like the kinds of militarized equipment OPD should have access to, or whether there should be less stringent rules for police chases. But Police Commission Chair Ricardo Garcia Acosta pushed back, saying he and his fellow commissioners work closely with Mitchell to help change department policies. Garcia Acosta told the public that blaming the commission undermines the integrity of an understaffed force that's doing their best. It's also worth noting that, as our public safety reporter Rosalind Romero has reported, the police commission was instrumental in bringing Mitchell to Oakland. They launched a nationwide search, conducted multiple interview rounds, and recruited him. Rosalind is still digging into exactly why Chief Mitchell resigned. Check out last week's episode, though, for an in-depth conversation with her and this big shakeup at OPD. On to our next story, the Oakland San Francisco Bay Airport. Yes, that's its actual name. The airport has joined at least 8 other airports in refusing to screen a video on overhead TVs from Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. This video blames Democrats for the federal government shutdown. Noem says in the recording, quote, Democrats in Congress refuse to fund the federal government, and because of this, many of our operations are impacted. That means maybe delayed flights and things like that at some airports. Airport officials across the country say the overtly partisan messaging may violate the Hatch Act. That's a federal law that limits political activity by federal civil servants. Port of Oakland spokesperson Kaylee Scantz told the Oaklandside that the video is not running at the Oakland airport and that the port doesn't expect screening or air traffic control services to be interrupted by the shutdown. Okay, here's another story. Reporter Ashley McBride had a beautiful story recently about the life and legacy of Reverend J. Alfred Smith Sr. Smith was the longtime pastor of Allen Temple Baptist Church. He died September 19th at age 94. Smith led Allen Temple from 1971 until his retirement in 2009. During that time, he grew the church's congregation, welcomed world leaders like Desmond Tutu, wrote more than a dozen books, testified before the United Nations, and went on missions around the world. But what actually defined Smith's ministry was his commitment to East Oakland. In the 1980s, his church acquired the Black Panthers' former headquarters, where Allen Temple's Family Life Center stands today. Smith talked a lot about the importance of ownership in the neighborhood, and the church built multiple senior housing complexes and housing for people living with HIV. Today, more than 200 people are housed in Allen Temple properties. Mayor Barbara Lee, who has called Allen Temple her church since the 1980s, told the Oaklandside that Smith was a, quote, warrior for peace and justice. Reverend Jacqueline Thompson, now the church's senior pastor, said Smith's phrase was, quote, we were not called to sit in the rocking chair of lazy religion. I highly recommend people checking out Ashley's story for more on Smith. Okay, here's some literary news. Oakland author Tommy Orange is among 22 recipients of the 2025 MacArthur Fellowship, commonly called the Genius Grant. Each fellow receives $800,000 with no strings attached, and the grant is a complete surprise. Orange is a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma and was a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for his novel There, which is set in Oakland. If you haven't read it, read it. It's great. His second novel, Wandering Stars, came out earlier this year. Okay, let's talk about money now, specifically taxes. Remember, the city faces a massive budget shortfall, over $250 million. When the council approved this year's budget back in June, they made cuts, but those cuts didn't close the budget gap entirely. So now they're looking at new taxes to raise revenue. Our City Hall reporter Eli Wolf was covering a recent council committee meeting where this came up. The top idea city leaders have right now is to try to get voters to pass another parcel tax on property owners. Oakland homeowners already pay multiple parcel taxes for police and fire, for libraries, for parks, and these add up in the city budget to hundreds of millions of dollars. To raise the money they need, the average homeowner would see their annual parcel tax bill increased by a couple $100s. Whether voters will go for this is uncertain given how much housing is taxed already. But one council member pointed to an opportunity. Oakland has been charging property owners a special levy to cover pensions for police and firefighters hired decades ago. That tax, obscurely known as PFERS, the Police and Fire Retirement System, will drop substantially next year, and that means property owners will actually see a tax decrease even if they pass this new tax. The council member suggested the city could pass a new tax right when that tax is set to sunset and not have to raise a homeowner's overall bill. The city is now looking to poll residents about what they'd support in a June ballot measure. Okay, here's the last story. Freelance sports reporter Eden Collier has a fascinating deep dive into why Oakland, a city that's produced NBA legends from Bill Russell to Damian Lillard, has sent so few women to the WNBA. The numbers are actually pretty stark. In the last 15 years, only 2 women from Oakland, Alexis Gray Lawson and Odera Chittum, have made it into the WNBA. The reasons have to do with infrastructure and opportunity. Before Title IX, Oakland girls had virtually no access to organized school sports. And even after Title IX passed in 1972, Oakland schools didn't fully implement this requirement for years. By the time the WNBA launched in 1997, Oakland girls were still catching up, and budget cuts starting in the late 1990s shut down after-school programs and led to closures of recreation centers. Gray Lawson, who now serves as the athletic director at Oakland Tech, told Eden, quote, I didn't even get to a big recruiting tournament until junior year. It really came down to being in the right place at the right time, and a lot of girls never got that chance. All right, that's it for headlines. We'll link to all this reporting in the show notes, and you can always find our reporting at oaklandside.org. Now let's dig into this week's main story. Our school's reporter Ashley McBride recently spent time at Skyline High School with a violence interrupter who works on the school's main campus every day to prevent fights and build relationships with students. Violence interrupters have been on OUSD campuses for 3 years now as part of a partnership between the Oakland Unified School District and the city's Department of Violence Prevention. The program started at 7 high schools and has expanded to 9. And since this program began, violence-related suspensions have gone down. But there's a catch. City funding runs out at the end of this school year, and it's unclear whether the program will continue. Ashley's story profiles Carla Ashford. Ashford spent years in and out of jail before turning her life around and becoming a violence interrupter. First, she worked on the streets of West Oakland, and now she's at Skyline. Ashford's philosophy is simple. Quote, "Only the hood can save the hood." Ashley, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Darwin.
Ashley, let's start with the basics. What is a school-based violence interrupter, and what does someone in that role actually do day to day at a high school?
Violence interrupters are a kind of approach to violence prevention where individuals who often are from the communities that they work in, and a lot of times they themselves have criminal backgrounds, maybe they sold drugs, maybe they were part of gangs and went to prison and are now charting a different path, trying to steer others away from that life. There's violence interrupters working in the streets who intervene after a shooting or some kind of altercation, and they talk to both sides to try to make sure things don't escalate and that there's no immediate retaliation. Then there's violence interrupters in schools who similarly mediate conflicts when students are fighting, and they try to calm things down and talk to each side, maybe bring them together to figure out how to move forward peacefully.
And what prompted the district to bring these violence interrupters into Oakland schools in the first place? And could you also explain which schools have these staffers?
Yeah, so this effort is part of a larger overhaul of school safety in Oakland. Before 2020, Oakland Unified had its own police department with security officers who patrolled campuses and armed police who responded to incidents on campus. But in the wake of the George Floyd murder and protests in 2020, the OUSD board voted to disband the police department and rethink the district's approach to school safety in a way that's less punitive and makes students feel more comfortable coming to school. But the situations that police were needed to address didn't necessarily go away with the police. There's still been instances of students bringing weapons to campuses, violent fights, and even a couple of school shootings. Violence interruption and prevention teams are one part of addressing those concerns, and violence interrupters are just one member of those teams, and they also include a life coach and a gender-based violence specialist. These teams exist at 9 OUSD schools, most of the comprehensive 9 to 12th grade schools and the alternative schools. There's a few 6th to 12th grade schools that don't have them.
Skyline High School wasn't one of the original schools to get a violence interrupter. What happened at Skyline that led school leaders and the city to decide that they needed to expand the program there?
Right. So this partnership between the Department of Violence Prevention and OUSD initially placed these positions at 7 OUSD schools, 3 of the comprehensive high schools, and 3 continuation and alternative schools. And last year, DVP gave a report to the city council and the school board about the program, and school board members called for them to expand it to Oakland Tech and Skyline, which weren't originally included. And Oakland Tech and Skyline are OUSD's biggest high schools. In the last few years, Skyline had a shooting after graduation last year that injured 3 people. A student was stabbed in 2022, and a shooting occurred on campus in 2023. So district leaders were probably thinking that these violence prevention efforts would make a big difference at Skyline. And for the expansion to Oakland Tech and Skyline, OUSD is footing the bill, not the city.
So let's talk about Carla Ashford. This is the Skyline violence interrupter that you interviewed. She spent years in and out of jail between the ages of 20 and 40 before turning her life around and doing the work she does now. Can you tell us more about her and how she brings these life experiences to the work she's doing?
Yeah, so I sat down with Miss Carla a few weeks ago at Skyline to talk about this work. She's originally from Union City, but she came to West Oakland to sell drugs starting when she was a teenager. She spent years in and out of prison as a young adult, and when she got out in 2009, she decided she wanted to leave that life behind. A few years later, she started doing violence prevention and outreach work in West Oakland, where she used to run. And she was doing that until last year when she was asked to come to Skyline.
She describes building trust with students, and this sometimes can involve just offering them something as simple as a snack. What does the actual conflict mediation process look like, though, when tensions arise between students?
So if you go read my story, you'll see photos that our photojournalist Florence Middleton took of one of these mediation sessions happening while Florence was photographing her. And it's pretty cool to see. But what happens is Carla will get called over when there's a fight or there's about to be a fight, and she pulls each student aside, lets them cool off, and then she asks them, would you be willing to sit down with the others and resolve this? Most of the time they're willing to, but sometimes it's still a little bit too soon. But once they come around, they sit together and they allow each side to say their piece. And Carla will ask, what would it look like for you guys to coexist on this campus? What can each of you do to resolve this peacefully? Or how can I help you all resolve this?
She talks in your story a lot about how kids today are dealing with a lot of fear. This is fear of getting shot, fear of getting jumped and beaten up, just the general fear of violence. How does she approach this reality with the students?
One misconception that people have about this work, Carla told me, is that people think that kids are just acting out just to act out, that they don't care about school or anything, and they just want to cause problems. But one big part of her job is finding out what else is going on. And there's always something else going on, Carla said. Teens might be witnessing violence at home or in their families or in their neighborhoods, and they bring that trauma to school with them. And she sees it as her role to figure out how to address that. Carla told me a story of a student she's been working with who's a senior now at Skyline, but they met last year when this student had just come back from a suspension, and the student had gotten in a fight. An assistant principal tried to break it up, and the student spat on them. When the student came back from being suspended, none of the other administrators wanted to deal with her, so Carla said, I'll check in with her. One thing Carla tries to emphasize with this student is, as long as you're going to class and taking care of your schoolwork, the principals and the admin and counselors are going to leave you alone. But if you're acting out, they're going to be on your case constantly. So she tells her, just stay on track, do what you need to do to graduate, and you'll be out of here and you can move on with your life.
In your piece, Carla, she has a quote. She says, only the hood can save the hood, and that you can't do this work if you just learned about it in school or read about it in a book. Can you unpack this philosophy of hers a little bit for us?
Yeah, I really loved that phrase, which is why I made it the headline to my story. It's really the philosophy that undergirds this particular approach to violence prevention, that the people who have lived this life of crime and street violence and came out on the other side are the best ambassadors to helping others exit or not go down that path to begin with. Carla talks to students about her background. One thing she often says to them is, you don't have to go down that route because I did it for you. You can choose a different path.
So it's hard to prove results, to prove causation, right? But in your story, you get into how after the first year of this program, the Oakland Unified School District saw a reduction in violence-related suspensions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Department of Violence Prevention noted that after the introduction of these teams in the 22-23 school year, OUSD saw violence-related suspensions decline by 10% at the high schools. They didn't go so far as to explicitly tie it to the violence prevention teams, but they're optimistic, and they're still working on the full evaluation and data on this program.
It'll be interesting to see that data when it comes out. There's a funding challenge, though, right? So the city has been paying for all, if not a large chunk of this work, right? And that funding runs out at the end of the school year. So what's going to happen to these violence interrupter positions if the district can't find money to keep paying for this?
Yeah, so as you said, the city is funding these teams, and it was always the intent that the Department of Violence Prevention would provide the initial funding, they would establish the structure and the foundation of the program, and OUSD would take over after a few years. I also recently sat down with Nelson Alegria, OUSD's Executive Director of Safety, a few weeks ago. He is the person tasked with overseeing all of this safety work in the district, and he said they have meetings with DVP every month, and they're working with OUSD to find grants or any other source of funding to continue the work. Nelson told me that everyone agrees that they want to continue funding these teams, but they may not be in the exact same format. So they have a violence interrupter, a life coach, and a gender-based violence specialist. And Nelson, who I also have a Q&A with on our site, said maybe not all the schools will have all three positions, but they're still waiting for more data and reports to evaluate which roles are most impactful at which sites. But they are, doing everything they can to find the funding to continue these programs.
Ashley, thank you so much for reporting on this work and writing this story and for taking time to talk to us about it.
Thanks, Darwin.
I encourage everyone to read Ashley's full story via the link in the show notes or at oaklandside.org. The portraits by photographer Florence Middleton help bring Carla's work to life. And if you're interested in violence interruption, our public safety reporter, Rosalind Romero, also published a story recently about a violence interruption academy that is coming to Oakland soon. This is exactly the kind of on-the-ground reporting that helps us understand what's actually happening in Oakland and Oakland schools. Not just budget numbers or the policy debates, but the real people doing the hard work of keeping kids safe. All right, that's it for this week's episode of Oaklandside 510. Again, a huge thanks to everyone who helped us reach our $15,000 fundraising goal. Because of you, we're bringing you weekly episodes for the next 6 months. Your support means everything to our small newsroom and your neighbors across the city. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen and share it with your Oakland friends and neighbors. The more people listening, the more we can justify keeping this show going for the long term. You can find all the stories we talked about today at oaklandside.org. Sign up for our daily newsletter to get all of our reporting delivered straight to your inbox every afternoon. This episode was produced by Callie Rhodes, edited by Esther Kaplan, and hosted by me, Oaklandside news editor Darwin BondGraham. On behalf of the entire Oaklandside team, thank you for showing up for Oakland. We'll see you next week.